Greetings. Welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Ryan Craven, and our guest today is Jessica Steinberg. Jessica is an associate professor in the Department of International Studies at Indiana University. Her research focuses on the political economy of development, local politics of natural resource extraction, territorial sovereignty, and violent conflict. She recently published a book in 2019 around natural resource extraction in Africa, and is going to share with us a little bit about the background of the book and the relevance of the topic today. Jessica, thanks for being here.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'd like to start maybe with the sort of more practical and scholarly justification for writing this book, as it's a bit shorter and maybe less long-winded, as it were.
Sure.
And that is really that, so much of our natural resources come from the African continent. So it has really an outsized proportion of the world's non-renewable resources in particular. So we're talking, at least at the time of the book, we're talking 60% of cobalt, which is used in lithium-ion batteries. We're talking 55% of the world's diamonds, 19% of gold, large portions of the world's phosphate reserves, which are used for fertilizer, as well as now coal, which, as you know, is used for heating, but is also used for the production of steel. So that makes the continent a particularly relevant and important place to think about questions of natural resource extraction and also the sort of consequences of instability around these processes. And so there's definitely a, sort of a practical, we should care because this is such a large part of our international economy. It's also the case that I'm sure that our audience is aware of a wide range of sort of stories and narratives that come through the media about sort of evil firms doing horrible things to local communities in these regions of natural resource extraction. That essentially that communities live in and around places where gold or coal or diamonds are extracted, and they face horrible living conditions or labor circumstances or even violence. And this has led to lots of activism around these questions and different forms of international governance schemes as well. And so this led to the question of, okay, do all of these regions of natural resource extraction experience these kinds of outcomes? They sound pretty horrible. Is there any alternative to this? And what might that look like? And what determines these outcomes? Can we avoid these really bad ones? And what does that mean both for international business actors, but also for local communities on the ground? And so that was really the motivating question, and it really speaks to a larger question about sort of geographies of power, right? And how sort of local context can really reflect trade-offs that governments have to make about access to revenue, right, through natural resource extraction, usually carried out by a foreign firm, and political support of communities on the ground who live in these regions, right, and need to have access to basic resources and goods and services. So that's the sort of practical and scholarly drive behind the book. Personally, I'd had this sort of experience of traveling in parts of Sub-Saharan Africa and being really surprised and interested in the ways in which governments broadcast their power over space, and essentially how in some places you see, so for instance, in parts of Northern Republic of Congo, you see the government providing beautifully paved roads and electricity. In other parts, you see that electricity only on for the week of the president's birthday, but not for the rest of the year, right? In other regions, you see the government completely absent, and you see international businesses and firms doing these things, providing potable water, right? Providing electricity. And so the real larger question is that natural resource sort of extraction enclaves can help us understand is, what is this relationship like? When do states do these things, and when do firms step in to do these things, and why? So that's the broader context of why I wrote this book, and I can talk to you a little bit more about how I explore these questions, if that's of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Just kind of hearing you talk about that, just some things that kind of brought to my awareness, right? Where some of the history in the U.S., right, around all the company towns and some of the coal areas and the pros and the cons of those kind of experiences. And, one thing for me to keep aware of as you're talking about these things too, right? It's Africa as a whole. There's varying countries and regions. It's not like the US where, hey, there's kind of an overarching government and there's the individual states and, the different, companies and corporations, but there's still some sort of overarching structure versus, so much of it is individualized into different regions and countries in Africa.
Yeah. And even to build on that, one of the most fascinating things is that you see differences and variations in these outcomes around natural resource extraction. When I say variations, let me just pause to explain what I mean by that. I mean, in some regions, you see local communities actually benefiting from natural resource extraction, getting jobs, getting access to water that might not have otherwise had, or electricity, or even housing. In other regions, you don't. Sometimes you see them protesting the failure to get access to those things. And sometimes you see the government responding to those protests violently. And sometimes you see them siding with communities and protecting them, right? So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to explain. And what's really interesting is that those different outcomes vary even within country and even within concessions held by the same firm. So that we might think, for instance, that a large international firm like, I'm going to leave off a specific business, that a large international natural resource extraction firm might have may sort of learn how to handle these kinds of situations. They make promises to local communities about what their natural resource extraction is going to bring, right, in terms of benefit, right? And so they learn how to engage with people on the ground to make sure that they don't cause environmental damage, et cetera, right? Yeah. And we see them being very successful at that in some places, and that same firm being very unsuccessful at that in others. We see one firm operating in Mozambique and being very successful with its engagement and work with the community there, and failing to do so in Madagascar and leading to violence and protests. Again, same firm. So we see this really interesting variation across countries, across firms, within firms, and within the same natural resources. And all of this variation suggests that it cannot be one of those things that explains these outcomes. It has to be some way of thinking in a disciplined way about how they all interact to yield these outcomes, right? So the extent to which local communities interact with a company as well as a government in what we would call a strategic way to result in these different outcomes.
Absolutely. And that, I think, kind of highlights, kind of the conversations that we have and the interest that we have in, international spaces in these conversations, as far as, there is not a one size fits all solution to really any situation. There's always variance and, different situations. And so having, just the awareness of that fact is pretty critical, I think. Kind of following up with that a little bit, if the pandemic highlighted one thing among many, in a lot of these conversations I'm having with other folks, right? It's how interconnected. It showcased how interconnected the world really is. Supply chains, goods, services, raw materials, certainly. And so, kind of following along those lines, like, why would you say it's important to raise awareness of, and raise the understanding kind of surrounding this conversation, this topic of, the natural resource extraction within Africa?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, and as you point out, so timely right now. And I think for me, through this book and even through some more recent work as well, it's really highlighted the extent to which supply chains, we've come to think of them as quite abstract networks in a lot of ways, that sort of bind us all together with this fabric that we can't necessarily see all the parts of. But at the end of the day, these are places, right, with people and specific contexts, right? And if we think about it that way, we start to sort of understand, first of all, that changes and shocks to supply chains not only affect consumers, but also producers, and especially, in many cases, the most vulnerable producers at the start of those supply chains. And that tends to be, for instance, natural resource extraction.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And it leads us to the following question. what are the forms of governance that facilitates the most equitable gains and losses from what is a very clearly increasingly globalized supply chain? So if we think about, for instance, the fact that our cell phone essentially requires sourced goods from over 18 countries at least, right? That's one product, 18 countries, and multiple factories, sites of extraction within those countries, right? So understanding how not only the national context shapes these outcomes and who benefits and loses from being more or less integrated into the supply chain, but also the international actors like firms and their codes of conduct, as well as local communities and the geographic and environmental context in which they operate, right, matters for understanding how sort of supply chains either are maintained or interrupted at various points in these networks.
Well, I think you highlighted on something that I didn't really think of specifically until you said it is, it's easy for us to be the consumer and complain like, oh, we can't get a new phone, we can't get new cars because of the chip shortage or, what have you, right? But, if that demand falls off, there's, very real people that are, doing the daily task, and this is most likely their sole source of income, and they have at the end of the day almost no control over the end result of their production, right? And it's wild for me to think about that in terms of even just kind of supply and demand of, hey, is Apple launching a new phone, and is there enough interest for it to justify having the level of extraction that's some of these towns and areas are used to, or are they going to have to all of a sudden lay off some of the workforce? And it's just wild to me to think consumer behavior can have that much of an impact.
Yeah. I mean, not only can consumer behavior have that much of an impact, but we also have these sort of broader governance schemes that really can shape reporting requirements, how the different nodes of the supply chain interact, such that, in order to get from one place to another, right, there are often environmental requirements, distribution requirements. There's just a lot that happens between the point of extraction for the very raw materials for these goods to the delivery of them by Amazon or whomever, right, to your doorstep. And so as you point out, sort of thinking beyond consumer-driven forces, thinking about what I think of as governance, what are the rules and regulations, who has power in these contexts to shape these different outcomes, both at the local level, but also across the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of at the start of the pandemic, I was talking to another faculty, and his area a specialty was kind of on the business side and economic side of Sub-Saharan Africa. And we got on the subject of supply chains and all of that. And he was using the pandemic to highlight the potential need or opportunity rather for not only, like you said, Africa has such a strong abundance of resources, but not really the next phase of what happens with resources, like the refinement, the manufacturing, and all of that. And so instead of the resources leaving Africa, going somewhere else to go to, kind of that end result, is there that opportunity for businesses and corporations to invest more in some of the actual production in Sub-Saharan Africa or Africa in general?
I mean, I think there is. I think more and more, lots of countries within Africa are implementing local value-added requirements. So stepping away from non-renewable resources to thinking about something like timber resources or forestry resources. There are a wide range of countries on the continent that are, for instance, adding the requirement that instead of exporting raw logs, they are going to, for instance, produce veneer that then can be shipped at a higher price point to some manufacturing plant for furniture, for instance. And so there is this attempt, but you could imagine that different industries require different levels of investment for that. And then developing the regulatory framework for that is also its own sort of capacity. That requires its own kind of capacity. right? And so there's sort of, not only do you need the human capital as well as the machinery and monetary capital, you also need frameworks not only for protecting business interests, but ensuring labor standards as well as environmental standards in order to sort of industrialize and go from raw material production to more industrialized merchandise production.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that perspective. I think having all three of those pillars, right? What's good for the community and the labor, what's good for the business, but also really kind of tying in that, like business and regulations and at the local and state level, city level, what have you, adds a whole nother layer of complication that is easy to overlook, right? It's easy to say, oh, I'm a large corporation, I'm going to go to this area and do X, Y, and Z. And you really need to have those conversations with the local population and the local government. Is that even feasible? Is that something they even want? Is it something that can even happen? Or what needs to change in order to get to that point? So that's extremely fascinating. And I appreciate you kind of sharing that.
Yeah, I think one other thing that you just highlighted, maybe just to point out, is the extent to which expectations matter. So one of the things that sort of comes out in the course of the book is the extent to which, yes, different actors, firms, communities, states have preferences about things, right? They want things to go a certain way. But the way they go about actually trying to get those things realized is based on what they expect other actors are going to do, what they anticipate, what they believe about other actors. And that means that those negotiations that you're talking about, right, those are going to look different in different contexts based on what these actors bring to the table and how they're thinking about each other, right? Are they expecting the government to repress a protest? Are they expecting the firm to actually provide these goods and services, or do they think it's going to renege? And how does that then shape how they interact and how they negotiate these outcomes?
Right. And so much of that is, cultural context that is nuanced and varies from region to region, from city to city. And honestly, as you were saying that, like historical perspectives, have they been burned in this process before? And that shapes how, accurately shapes their response.
Exactly. And we do, for instance, see one of the empirical findings is we do see a fair amount of violence around natural resource extraction, specifically relative to other regions, in part because of the interest of governments in protecting access to natural resource revenues, right? So they want to sort of say, stop protesting because you're affecting our capacity to turn these natural resources into revenue, right? And that can lead to more violent outcomes, right?
Yep.
And we might really sort of care about understanding why and when that happens. But as a result of those experiences, then you have communities that have rightfully developed a fear and anticipation that that is the outcome, right? And that shapes the way in which firms can engage with them on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is good. Thank you for sharing those perspectives and a little bit of that background. It's a fascinating topic, continuing to be a relevant topic, and I think, in my opinion, it continues to highlight, the importance of just cultural context and understanding, at least trying to an attempt to understand the differences and how different regions and areas and businesses operate. And how all that, honestly, at this point, really relates to the world as a whole. Can't afford to be, and we're increasingly less and less isolated.
Yes, that is certainly the case, and I don't see us atomizing anytime soon, in spite of the pandemic and all of its consequences.
Well, thanks again for your time.
Thanks very much for having me. Appreciate it.
That's it for this edition of Cyber Focus. For future topics and suggestions, please drop us a line at cyber@indiana.edu.